In 1970, the American muscle car war was reaching its most outrageous point. Detroit's manufacturers were no longer simply building fast cars. They were competing to create machines that could dominate the streets, the drag strip, and the imagination of an entire generation. Every year seemed to bring another car with a bigger engine, more aggressive styling, and an even more ridiculous horsepower claim. Chevrolet had the Chevelle SS. Pontiac had transformed the GTO into an icon. Oldsmobile had the increasingly aggressive 442. Plymouth had the Road Runner, GTX, and Superbird. Dodge had the Charger and Challenger. Ford had the Mustang and Torino Cobra. And then there was Buick. To most people, Buick didn't exactly sound like a brand preparing for war. Buick had a reputation for building comfortable, sophisticated automobiles for buyers who wanted a little more luxury and refinement. Its cars were generally associated with smooth rides, large interiors, polished styling, and effortless cruising. If someone in 1970 told you that Buick had built one of the most brutally powerful muscle cars of the entire era, you might have assumed they were exaggerating. But Buick had been quietly developing a performance identity of its own. The foundation for that identity was the Buick Grand Sport, commonly known as the GS. Buick had already discovered that its large displacement V8 engines could produce enormous amounts of torque. The company wasn't necessarily interested in copying Chevrolet or Pontiac. Instead, Buick was developing something with its own personality. Then came 1970. This was the moment when Buick decided to turn the volume up. The result was the GSX. The name itself stood for Grand Sport Experimental, although by the time the car reached production, there was nothing experimental about the amount of hardware Buick had packed into it. The GSX was intended to be Buick's answer to the wildest muscle cars coming from Detroit. And Buick didn't simply take a regular GS, install a big engine, and put a few badges on it. The GSX was given a much more aggressive identity. The body received distinctive stripes that immediately separated the car from ordinary Buicks. The rear spoiler gave the car a sportier profile. The hood featured one of the most recognizable details of the entire package: a tachometer mounted prominently on top of the hood, directly in front of the driver. It was a strange-looking feature by today's standards, but that was part of its charm. The tachometer practically announced that this wasn't an ordinary Buick. This was a Buick designed for someone who cared about what happened when the accelerator went to the floor. The GSX also received special wheels, performance-oriented suspension components, GSX identification, and other details that transformed its appearance. But none of those things were the reason enthusiasts would eventually remember the car. The real story was underneath the hood. Buick offered two versions of the GSX for 1970. The standard car received the 455 cubic inch Buick V8. That alone was enough to make the car serious. But Buick had something even more aggressive waiting in the wings: the Stage 1. The Buick 455 Stage 1 was officially rated at 360 horsepower. That number, by itself, doesn't tell the full story. The truly astonishing figure was torque. The Stage 1 produced a factory-rated 510 pound-feet of torque. That was an enormous amount of twisting force. In fact, the Stage 1's torque output was one of the defining characteristics of the entire car. This was not an engine that needed to scream at extremely high engine speeds before it became powerful. Buick's massive V8 had the kind of low-end and mid-range torque that could make the car feel as though an invisible hand had simply grabbed it and thrown it forward. That characteristic completely changed the personality of the GSX. When you drove a high-revving performance car, you might have to wait for the engine to build momentum before the acceleration became violent. The Stage 1 didn't really play that game. The power was already there. Push the throttle down, and the giant Buick engine responded with a wall of torque. The rear tires could quickly become the weakest link in the entire equation. And that was one of the most fascinating things about the GSX Stage 1. The car was large. It was relatively heavy. It looked substantial. It didn't have the compact proportions that people typically associated with lightweight performance cars. But underneath that substantial body was an engine with enough torque to make the entire car feel much lighter than it actually was. This was the kind of car that could surprise people. A driver might see the Buick approaching and assume it was simply another large American coupe. Then the traffic light would change. The Buick would squat down under acceleration. The engine would unleash its torque. And suddenly the supposedly comfortable Buick would be charging forward with the kind of violence normally associated with the most famous muscle cars in America. That sleeper quality was one of the GSX's greatest strengths. It didn't have to look like a race car. It didn't need enormous wings or exaggerated bodywork to prove something. The GSX could simply sit there looking expensive, sophisticated, and slightly unusual. Then you opened the throttle, and everything changed. Buick understood that a giant engine alone wasn't enough. Muscle cars were becoming increasingly sophisticated during this period. Manufacturers were learning that producing huge amounts of power required stronger drivetrains, better suspension, and improved handling characteristics. The GSX was therefore equipped with performance hardware intended to make the car capable of putting its power onto the road. The suspension was tuned for performance rather than simply comfort. The braking system had to deal with the demands of a powerful and heavy automobile. The drivetrain had to survive the punishment generated by that enormous V8, and the chassis had to deal with the forces created every time the driver buried the accelerator. All of this mattered because the Stage 1 wasn't merely powerful on paper. It was a complete performance package, and the engine itself was a fascinating piece of Buick engineering. The 455 cubic inch V8 was physically large, but its character was very different from what some people might expect from an enormous American engine. Its enormous displacement meant Buick didn't need to rely entirely on extremely high engine speeds to create acceleration. Instead, the engine generated enormous torque relatively low in the rev range. That made the GSX feel effortless. It wasn't constantly begging the driver to rev it harder. It simply pushed hard. And because torque was so abundant, the car could deliver astonishing acceleration without needing the kind of complicated driving technique associated with smaller performance engines. You didn't need to keep the engine screaming. You simply needed to press the accelerator. That simplicity was part of the appeal. The GSX Stage 1 represented a very specific philosophy of American performance. Make the engine enormous. Make the torque enormous. Give the car enough chassis and drivetrain hardware to handle the power. Then point it toward the horizon. It was an approach that perfectly captured the personality of the muscle car era. But there was another reason the GSX Stage 1 was so interesting. It came from Buick. That mattered. The badge on the front of the car didn't carry the same street racing reputation as Chevrolet's SS or Pontiac's GTO. Buick wasn't the brand most teenagers dreamed about when they imagined themselves at a drag strip. That gave the GSX a strange advantage. It could fly under the radar. The car wasn't invisible, of course. The GSX had distinctive stripes, aggressive wheels, a spoiler, and that unmistakable hood-mounted tachometer. But compared with some of the outrageous machines coming from Dodge, Plymouth, and other manufacturers, the Buick still carried an air of sophistication. It looked like something an executive might drive, until the engine started. That contrast became one of the most memorable characteristics of the car. The GSX could be refined when you wanted it to be, but when you demanded performance, the car revealed an entirely different personality. And that dual personality was something Buick had perfected. The company wasn't trying to build a stripped-down race car. It was building a high-performance Buick. That distinction is important. The GSX wasn't designed to abandon everything Buick stood for. Instead, it combined Buick's traditional emphasis on comfort and refinement with a level of performance that seemed almost inappropriate for the brand. It was a luxury-oriented muscle car before that idea became fashionable. And the Stage 1 took that concept to its extreme. The engine's enormous torque meant the car could accelerate with incredible authority. The styling made it recognizable. The suspension and drivetrain made it usable, and the rarity made it special. But when the GSX first appeared, nobody could know how difficult these cars would eventually become to find. At the time, the muscle car market was incredibly crowded. Buyers had dozens of choices. If you wanted a performance car, you weren't limited to one or two models. You could walk into a dealership and choose between cars from almost every major American manufacturer. That made the GSX's existence particularly remarkable. Buick was essentially asking buyers to look beyond the obvious choices. Instead of buying the muscle car everyone expected you to buy, Buick wanted you to consider something different, something more sophisticated, something less obvious, something that could potentially surprise almost anyone who underestimated it. And beneath the hood was the Stage 1 engine. This was the part of the equation that changed everything. The official horsepower figure might have looked modest compared with some of the wildest claims coming from Detroit, but horsepower numbers didn't tell the entire story. The Stage 1's torque was what made the car frightening. 510 pound-feet of torque gave the Buick a tremendous ability to launch and accelerate, and real-world performance was where the car began to build its reputation. The GSX Stage 1 quickly demonstrated that Buick's supposedly conservative image had nothing to do with what the car could actually do. The car could run with, and in some circumstances embarrass, many of the muscle cars that received far more attention. That was the beginning of the GSX's legend. It wasn't necessarily the loudest legend, it wasn't the most famous, it wasn't the car that appeared on every poster. But among people who understood what the Stage 1 actually was, the reputation was very different. They knew that Buick had built something serious, something that could turn a quiet street into a drag strip in a matter of seconds, something that could take a large, luxury-oriented coupe and give it the heart of a drag racer. And that is what makes the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 so fascinating today. It represents one of the final moments when American manufacturers were willing to build cars that seemed almost completely unreasonable. A massive V8, a huge amount of torque, rear-wheel drive, a performance suspension, aggressive styling, and very little concern for fuel economy or what the future might look like. The industry was changing rapidly, emissions regulations were becoming increasingly important, insurance costs for high-performance cars were rising, fuel economy was beginning to matter, and the golden age of American muscle was approaching its end. But Buick managed to squeeze one extraordinary machine into that narrow window. The GSX Stage 1 wasn't simply another muscle car, it was Buick's statement that the company could play the same game as everyone else, and it could play it extremely well. The most interesting part, however, was still coming. Because once people actually got these cars onto the street, the Stage 1 began revealing just how serious that enormous 455 really was. The numbers were impressive, the reputation was growing, and the cars were proving that a Buick could be much more dangerous than its badge suggested. The forgotten Buick wasn't merely fast for a luxury-oriented car, it was fast, period. By the time the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 began appearing on American roads, the muscle car world had already become obsessed with one thing: speed. Horsepower figures were printed across advertisements. Dealerships displayed engine specifications like trophies. Magazine tests were dissecting quarter-mile times, acceleration figures, and top speeds. Young buyers wanted to know which car was faster, which engine was more powerful, and which machine could dominate the street. And this was where the Buick GSX Stage 1 began to reveal its real personality. Because on paper, the Buick didn't necessarily look like the ultimate muscle car. Its official horsepower rating was 360. That number was respectable, but it didn't immediately scream domination. Other manufacturers were advertising much larger horsepower figures, and some of the most famous muscle cars of the era were equipped with engines that sounded far more intimidating. But horsepower wasn't the whole story. The Stage 1's secret weapon was torque, 510 pound-feet of it. That enormous figure fundamentally changed the way the Buick behaved. The moment the accelerator was pressed, the massive 455 cubic inch V8 could unleash a tremendous amount of twisting force. Instead of requiring the driver to wait for the engine to climb toward the upper end of the rev range, the Buick delivered its strength early. The result was an almost violent sense of acceleration. The GSX Stage 1 didn't feel like it was desperately trying to become fast. It felt like it was simply deciding to become fast. That distinction is important. A car with a powerful engine can sometimes feel impressive only when driven aggressively. The Stage 1 was different. Even at relatively modest engine speeds, the engine had enough torque to make the car feel exceptionally strong. You could feel the engine working through the entire body of the car. The front end would become lighter, the rear suspension would squat. The tires would struggle to convert all that torque into forward motion, and the Buick would begin charging forward. This was one of the reasons the GSX Stage 1 developed such a strong reputation among people who actually drove these cars. The Buick's performance wasn't theoretical. It was physical. You could feel it, you could hear it, and you could see the road disappearing behind you. The car's size made the experience even more dramatic. The GSX wasn't a tiny sports car. It was a substantial American coupe, carrying a big body and a big engine. There was something almost absurd about watching such a large automobile accelerate with that kind of authority. It was as if Buick had taken one of its comfortable grand touring cars and secretly turned it into a drag strip weapon. And that was exactly what made the GSX so entertaining. It didn't need to pretend to be something else. It was still a Buick, but it was a Buick with an attitude. The Stage 1 engine was the center of the entire experience. The 455 cubic inch V8 had enormous displacement, and Buick's engine design emphasized torque rather than simply chasing an enormous peak horsepower number. That made it particularly effective in real-world acceleration. When you were already moving and pushed the throttle down, the engine didn't need to spend a long time gathering momentum. The torque was immediately available. The car surged forward. That meant the GSX could be brutally effective in situations where acceleration mattered more than a theoretical top-speed figure. A rolling acceleration run could become especially entertaining because the Stage 1 had so much torque available without requiring the engine to operate at extreme RPM. The automatic transmission also complemented this personality. Instead of requiring the driver to constantly manage the engine, the transmission could keep the Buick moving while the big V8 did what it did best: make torque, lots of it. The GSX Stage 1 also demonstrated something that is often misunderstood about classic muscle cars. Performance wasn't always about having the highest horsepower number. Gearing, torque, vehicle weight, traction, transmission behavior, and the engine's power curve all mattered. The Stage 1 had a combination that worked extremely well. The giant engine provided enormous torque. The drivetrain transmitted that force to the rear wheels. The suspension helped keep the car under control, and the driver had an enormous amount of power available with a simple movement of the accelerator. The result was a car that could feel much faster than its official specifications suggested. And then there was the sound. A Stage 1 wasn't exactly subtle when its engine came alive. The deep rumble of the big Buick V8 immediately separated it from ordinary cars. At idle, the engine had that unmistakable American V8 character. But as the throttle opened, the sound became deeper, harder, and more aggressive. There was no mistaking the fact that something serious was under the hood. The hood-mounted tachometer added to the experience. Instead of hiding the engine's RPM information somewhere inside the dashboard, Buick placed the tachometer directly in the driver's line of sight. It was almost as if Buick wanted to remind the driver that this car wasn't built merely for comfortable transportation. The tachometer was a visual declaration. This was a performance machine. The GSX's styling reinforced that message. The stripes running along the body gave the car an unmistakable appearance. The spoiler added aggression to the rear. The wheels gave it a stronger stance. The GSX identification told anyone who knew muscle cars that this wasn't an ordinary grand sport. But the overall shape remained unmistakably Buick. That combination made the car unique. It was aggressive without looking completely outrageous. It was powerful without looking like a dedicated race car, and it was sophisticated enough that someone unfamiliar with muscle cars could easily underestimate it. That was dangerous, because the Stage 1 could punish an underestimation very quickly. During the muscle car era, street reputation mattered almost as much as magazine numbers. A car could have an impressive specification sheet, but if people weren't talking about it, its legend didn't grow. The GSX Stage 1 began to earn that conversation. People discovered that the Buick wasn't just another comfortable coupe with a big engine. It was capable of serious acceleration. And the more people experienced it, the more interesting the car became. There was also something psychologically satisfying about beating expectations. Imagine lining up at a stoplight next to a driver in a much more famous muscle car. The other car might have a reputation. It might have a legendary badge. It might look faster. The Buick might even look like the more civilized machine. Then the light changes. The driver pushes the accelerator. The Buick's 455 responds. The rear tires fight for traction. And suddenly, the car beside you realizes that the quiet-looking Buick is not playing around. That was the GSX's personality. It didn't necessarily need to announce itself. It simply needed a clear road. The Stage 1's enormous torque also meant the car could feel remarkably strong even when it wasn't being driven at maximum intensity. This was part of the reason Buick's approach worked so well for grand touring. You could cruise comfortably. You could drive normally. And then, whenever the opportunity appeared, the engine could transform the character of the entire automobile. That duality was one of the greatest strengths of the GSX. It wasn't a one-dimensional machine. It could be a comfortable cruiser. It could be a highway car. It could be a street bruiser. And when properly prepared, it could become a formidable drag strip machine. The fact that Buick could combine those characteristics in one car was impressive. But there was another factor that helped the GSX Stage 1. The car was relatively rare, and rarity can amplify reputation. The GSX wasn't produced in enormous numbers. Compared with more mainstream muscle cars, relatively few examples were built. That meant you weren't going to see them on every street corner. The average American buyer was much more likely to encounter a Chevelle, Mustang, Camaro, Charger, or other popular performance car than a GSX. As a result, the Buick gradually became something of an insider's car. You had to know what you were looking at. If you didn't recognize the GSX package, the car could simply look like an unusually aggressive Buick. But enthusiasts knew better. They knew about the Stage 1. They knew about the 455. They knew about the enormous torque figure. And they knew that the Buick could move. This created an interesting divide between appearance and reality. The appearance suggested sophistication. The engine suggested violence. And the performance proved that the engine wasn't just for show. But perhaps the most impressive thing about the Stage 1 was how much performance Buick managed to extract without completely abandoning the car's grand touring character. The GSX wasn't stripped down to the point of becoming uncomfortable. It wasn't built exclusively for competition. It still had the character of a Buick. That made it different from some of the more focused muscle cars. The car could be enjoyed on the street without feeling like you were driving a machine that had been designed solely to survive a quarter-mile run. Yet when you demanded acceleration, the Stage 1 engine was ready. That balance helped make the car special. It also helps explain why the GSX Stage 1 has become increasingly respected by classic muscle car enthusiasts. For decades, the most famous muscle cars dominated the conversation. Collectors talked endlessly about Hemi-powered Mopars, big-block Chevelles, GTOs, Boss Mustangs, and other household names. The Buick often sat somewhere in the background, but people who understand the numbers eventually started asking an obvious question. How could a relatively understated Buick produce this much torque and this much real-world performance? The answer was sitting directly beneath that long hood. The Stage 1 wasn't a marketing trick, it was a serious performance engine, and Buick's decision to put it into the GSX created one of the most interesting combinations of the muscle car era. The car was large, the engine was enormous, the torque was monstrous, and the reputation was growing. But there was still one thing working against the GSX. It arrived at almost exactly the wrong time. The American muscle car golden age was about to change dramatically. The environment that had allowed manufacturers to build giant engines and sell them to relatively young buyers was beginning to disappear. Insurance companies were becoming increasingly hostile toward high-performance cars. Emissions regulations were becoming more restrictive. Fuel economy was becoming a larger concern. And the broader automotive industry was beginning to move away from the extreme performance philosophy that had defined the late 1960s. The GSX Stage 1 was therefore something of a final statement. Buick had managed to build a car that represented the absolute peak of its traditional muscle car philosophy, just as that philosophy was beginning to disappear. And that made the 1970 GSX especially significant. It wasn't simply another muscle car, it was a snapshot of an era when a manufacturer could take a massive American coupe, install a giant V8, give it an enormous amount of torque, and sell it to ordinary customers. No turbocharger, no electric motor, no complicated computer-controlled powertrain, no sophisticated traction control system, just displacement, mechanical engineering, rear-wheel drive, and a driver's right foot. That simplicity is part of what makes the car so fascinating today. Everything about it feels mechanical. You don't merely press the accelerator and experience acceleration. You feel the engine. You feel the transmission shift. You feel the rear tires working. You hear the exhaust. You can sense the enormous mass of the car moving forward. The experience is physical. And that physicality is exactly what modern cars often struggle to reproduce. Modern performance cars can be dramatically faster. They can launch harder. They can corner better. They can brake better. But the GSX Stage 1 offers something completely different. It gives the driver a direct connection to the machinery. There is nothing understated about the way a giant American V8 delivers power. The car doesn't feel like it's calculating what to do. It feels like mechanical force. And that is why the Stage 1 became such an important part of Buick's history. The forgotten Buick had proven that it could compete. It had proven that a luxury-oriented manufacturer could build a serious muscle car, and it had proven that a relatively conservative-looking coupe could become a monster when equipped with the right engine. But the GSX's story wasn't going to end with its impressive performance. In fact, the strangest part was still ahead. Because despite its speed, its engineering, and its enormous torque, the GSX never achieved the same level of fame as many of its rivals. Production numbers were low, the muscle car era collapsed, and the Buick disappeared from public attention. For years, the GSX Stage 1 became one of those cars that serious enthusiasts knew about while the broader public forgot. But forgotten does not mean insignificant. Because when collectors and historians began looking back at the golden age of American muscle, they discovered something remarkable. One of the most powerful and fastest Buicks ever built had been hiding in plain sight, and its story was about to become even more valuable. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 had everything a muscle car needed to become a legend. It had an enormous engine. It had one of the highest factory torque ratings of the era. It had aggressive styling, it had serious performance, and, perhaps most importantly, it had the ability to surprise people. But somehow, the GSX never became as famous as many of the cars it could compete with. That might be the strangest part of its entire story. Because while the public remembers the Chevelle, GTO, Road Runner, Charger, Challenger, and Mustang, the Buick GSX Stage 1 often feels like a forgotten chapter in the history of American muscle. And to understand why, you have to look at the moment in which Buick built it. The GSX arrived in 1970, right at the peak of the muscle car era. It was an incredible time for American performance cars. Manufacturers were fighting for buyers with increasingly powerful engines and increasingly aggressive designs. But underneath all that excitement, the industry was already changing. Insurance companies were becoming increasingly concerned about high-performance automobiles. Young drivers were discovering that owning a powerful muscle car could come with extremely expensive insurance premiums. Government regulations were becoming stricter. Emissions requirements were tightening. Fuel economy was becoming more important, and the manufacturers were beginning to realize that the era of enormous displacement and unrestricted performance wasn't going to continue forever. The GSX Stage 1 was therefore something of a last hurrah. Buick had created an incredibly powerful machine at precisely the moment when the automotive world was beginning to turn away from that philosophy. And the timing had another consequence. The GSX simply didn't sell in the kinds of numbers that could guarantee it a permanent place in popular culture. The car was specialized. It was expensive compared with ordinary vehicles. It was aimed at a relatively small group of buyers, and Buick's traditional customer base wasn't necessarily the same group of people who were lining up to buy the wildest muscle cars in America. That created an unusual situation. The GSX was a performance car from a manufacturer that wasn't primarily identified with street performance. Someone shopping for a muscle car might immediately think of Chevrolet, Pontiac, Plymouth, Dodge, or Ford. Buick wasn't always the first name that came to mind. But for the people who did understand Buick's performance capabilities, the GSX Stage 1 could be an incredibly attractive proposition. You got the huge engine, you got the torque, you got the aggressive appearance, and you got the Buick personality. That combination was unusual. The GSX wasn't trying to imitate a Road Runner. It wasn't trying to become a GTO. It was its own kind of muscle car. And perhaps that's why it has aged so well. The cars that are remembered most strongly are often the ones with the most obvious personalities. The GSX had a quieter personality. But underneath that quietness was a serious amount of hardware. Its Stage 1 455 was the heart of the machine. 510 pound-feet of torque was an extraordinary figure for the period. And while factory horsepower ratings can sometimes be misleading when comparing cars from different manufacturers and eras, torque tells us something important about the personality of this particular Buick. This was an engine designed to produce enormous force without requiring extreme engine speeds. That made the GSX particularly effective in everyday acceleration. It didn't need to scream. It didn't need to sound frantic. It simply needed throttle. And once that throttle was opened, the car could move with surprising urgency. That was the magic of the Stage 1. It wasn't merely powerful. It felt powerful. There is a difference. A specification sheet can tell you how much horsepower an engine produces. It can tell you how much torque it produces. It can tell you the weight of the vehicle, but it cannot tell you what it feels like when a giant V8 begins delivering hundreds of pound-feet of torque through the rear wheels. That is something you have to experience. The Buick's acceleration could make the entire car feel alive. The nose would react. The rear suspension would load up. The tires would search for traction. The engine would growl, and the car would begin moving forward with the kind of force that made the Buick's large dimensions almost irrelevant. That sensation is part of why classic muscle cars remain so fascinating. They weren't necessarily engineered to be perfect. They were engineered to be exciting, and the GSX was certainly exciting. But its story after the muscle car era was very different from that of some of its more famous competitors. As the 1970s progressed, the muscle car market began collapsing. High-performance engines were being restricted. Horsepower was declining. Manufacturers were responding to regulations and changing consumer priorities. The wild cars of the late 1960s and early 1970s were disappearing. The GSX was no exception. The era that had created the Stage 1 was fading away. And when the cars stopped being produced, something unexpected happened. People stopped paying attention to them. That may sound strange today, because classic muscle cars are extremely valuable and highly collectible. But that wasn't always the case. For a long period, many classic cars were simply old cars. A powerful machine that had once been exciting could become an outdated used car sitting in someone's driveway. Some were modified, some were raced, some were neglected. Some were scrapped. And some were simply driven until they were no longer economically practical to repair. The GSX suffered from being relatively obscure. Because it wasn't as famous as some of the biggest names in the muscle car world, it didn't always receive the same level of preservation. An enthusiast might understand the value of a rare Hemi-powered Mopar, but an ordinary owner might not realize that the Buick sitting in their garage was an extremely important piece of muscle car history. That is one reason surviving examples became increasingly significant. Every original car that disappeared made the remaining cars more interesting. And as the collector market matured, enthusiasts began looking beyond the obvious choices. The conversation around American muscle gradually expanded. Collectors started appreciating unusual cars. They started looking at factory performance packages. They started examining production numbers. They started comparing original specifications. And eventually, the GSX Stage 1 began receiving the recognition it had been missing. Suddenly, the forgotten Buick didn't look so ordinary anymore. It looked rare. It looked historically important. And it looked extremely fast. The car's combination of rarity and performance made it particularly attractive to collectors. The GSX package itself was unusual. The Stage 1 option made it even more special, and original, well-preserved examples became increasingly difficult to find. That scarcity changed the way people viewed the car. Instead of being remembered as an old Buick, it became a genuine muscle car collectible. And perhaps the most interesting part is that the car didn't need modern reinterpretation to become impressive. You don't need to imagine what the GSX could have been. Buick already built it. The factory car itself was the legend. The engine was enormous, the torque was enormous, the styling was distinctive, and the performance was real. That authenticity is one of the biggest reasons classic muscle cars continue to attract enthusiasts. The GSX represents a time when manufacturers were willing to build cars that would be almost impossible to justify today. Imagine a modern luxury-oriented manufacturer taking one of its large coupes and installing an enormous naturally aspirated V8, designed primarily around torque. Imagine giving it rear-wheel drive, a performance suspension, aggressive gearing, loud exhaust, and a giant tachometer mounted on the hood. Then imagine selling it to ordinary customers. That was the world that produced the GSX, and that world no longer exists. The GSX therefore represents more than just a fast Buick. It represents the end of an era before modern electronic driving aids became common, an era before turbocharging and electrification transformed performance, an era when displacement was king, an era when the solution to a performance problem was often remarkably simple. Build a bigger engine. Give it more torque, strengthen the drivetrain, put the power through the rear wheels, and let the driver figure out what to do with it. There is something almost beautiful about that simplicity. The GSX Stage 1 doesn't try to hide its mechanical nature. You know there is a huge engine under the hood. You can hear it, you can feel it, you can see the tachometer. And when the throttle is opened, the entire personality of the car changes. That rawness is precisely what makes the car so different from modern performance machines. Modern cars can be objectively faster. They can accelerate more quickly, they can corner harder, they can stop in shorter distances. But the GSX offers a different kind of excitement. It feels mechanical. It feels analog. It feels like the driver and the machine are directly connected, and that is increasingly rare. There is another reason the GSX Stage 1 deserves recognition. It proves that the American muscle car story wasn't only about the biggest and most famous brands. Performance existed in unexpected places. Buick had the engineering capability to build a monster. It simply chose to package that monster differently. Instead of making the car look completely outrageous, Buick gave it enough sophistication to remain recognizable as a Buick. That was part of the genius. The GSX could be intimidating without becoming ridiculous. It could be comfortable without becoming boring. It could be luxurious without sacrificing serious performance. And it could surprise almost anyone who didn't know what was hiding underneath the hood. That combination is difficult to reproduce. It was also one of the reasons the GSX Stage 1 became such a respected sleeper. The term sleeper is usually used for cars that look ordinary but perform far beyond expectations. The GSX wasn't completely ordinary. The stripes and spoiler gave it away to anyone familiar with Buick performance cars. But compared with some of the most outrageous muscle cars of the era, it was still relatively understated. That made its performance even more satisfying. The GSX didn't need to scream for attention. It could simply prove itself when the road opened. And that brings us back to the central question. Why was this car forgotten? The answer isn't that it wasn't good enough. It wasn't forgotten because it was slow. It wasn't forgotten because Buick failed to build a serious performance machine. It was forgotten because history is selective. Certain cars become cultural icons. Others become enthusiast secrets. The GSX became an enthusiast secret. For decades, people who knew muscle cars understood what a Stage 1 meant, but the wider public often didn't. And that actually makes the car more interesting. Because discovering a GSX Stage 1 today can feel like discovering a missing piece of American automotive history. It is a car that deserves to be discussed alongside the famous muscle machines of its era. Not because it looks like them, not because it carries the same badge, but because it belongs to the same extraordinary period when American manufacturers were pushing performance to extremes. The GSX Stage 1 was Buick's contribution to that madness, and it was a serious contribution. The car proved that Buick could build a muscle car capable of delivering extraordinary acceleration. It proved that a large, luxury-oriented coupe could become a legitimate performance machine. It proved that torque could be just as important as horsepower. And it proved that sometimes the most dangerous car in the room isn't the one making the most noise. Sometimes it's the one sitting quietly in the corner. That is the legacy of the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. It was powerful without needing to brag. It was rare without trying to be collectible. It was sophisticated without being soft. And it was fast enough to earn the respect of people who actually understood what they were looking at. Today, surviving examples are reminders of a very different automotive world. A world where a manufacturer could build a car around a giant, naturally aspirated V8 and enormous amounts of torque. A world where performance didn't require computers, batteries, turbochargers, or complicated electronic systems. A world where the driver could feel almost every mechanical movement happening beneath them. The GSX Stage 1 came from the final moments of that world. And perhaps that's why its legend has grown stronger with time. When the car was new, it was simply another high-performance Buick fighting for attention in a crowded marketplace. Decades later, it has become something much more important. It is a survivor from the final golden age of American muscle. It is proof that Buick could build something seriously fast, and it is one of the clearest examples of how misleading a car's badge can sometimes be. Because if you only looked at the word Buick, you might have expected comfort. If you looked at the styling, you might have expected luxury. But if you looked underneath the hood, you found something completely different. You found a 455 cubic inch V8. You found 510 pound-feet of torque, and you found a machine capable of reminding the entire muscle car world that Buick wasn't playing around. The 1970 GSX Stage 1 may never become as universally famous as the most iconic muscle cars of the era. But perhaps that is part of its appeal. It doesn't need to be the most famous. It only needs to be remembered by the people who understand it. Because once you know what the GSX Stage 1 really was, it becomes almost impossible to look at it as just another old Buick. It was a muscle car. A genuine one. And not merely a muscle car that happened to come from Buick. It was one of the most fascinating examples of what Buick could accomplish when the company decided to unleash everything it had. A forgotten name, a massive engine, a mountain of torque, a rare production run, and a reputation that refused to completely disappear. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 may have been overlooked for decades, but it was never ordinary. It was seriously fast. And now, more than half a century later, that forgotten Buick has finally earned its place among the great American muscle cars.